Salutations and welcome to the 20th episode of the English Sovereigns podcast series. We are nearly now a third of the way through the series. In this episode I shall be discussing the last monarch from the House of Wessex, namely King Edward the Confessor. There's been quite a lot of historical debate and discourse about the reign of King Edward II and how he was as a man. And I say Edward II again because he should have been called Edward II, but I've discussed this quite a few times in my podcast already, so I won't go into the reasons. He is known as Edward the Confessor instead. So just before I get into that historical disagreement, a little bit of background is probably necessary. He was the seventh son of King Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy. He didn't expect to become king, but obviously circumstances in the mid-1010s were quite different to how he expected, and so he became the heir of the House of Wessex. He was the half-brother of Edmund II, therefore, through Ethelred, and the half-brother of Harthacnut through Emma of Normandy. And it's probably like that Harthacnut in 1041 invited Edward over to England to offer him the crown upon Harthacnut's own death, which subsequently happened in 1042, so Edward became the king. So, the charge laid against Edward was that he was weak and ineffectual, and the prime evidence for this was that he allowed the power of the Godwin family to grow past the point of no return. So, they were the sole family in complete charge of southern England, so basically Wessex, in 1045, and 10 years later they, through marriages, through scheming, had become the earls of all of the earldoms of England, with the exception of Mercia. So Edward allowed this to happen either through incompetence or just not giving enough of a care about it, really. There is evidence to suggest that maybe Edward did try and resist, so in 1051 Edward vetoed the appointment of one of the Earl of Godwin's relatives to become Archbishop of Canterbury. Godwin did go into exile briefly, but came back and was able to convince the nobleman that it was Norman courtiers around Edward that were causing him to prevent the influence of his family from growing, and the nobleman agreed with him, and so forced Edward to give Godwin and his family his lands back, including making Edith, who was the sister of Harold Godwinson, making her to become queen again because she was married to Edward initially, but he had dismissed them when he got rid of the Godwins briefly in 1051. And plus, he was forced to appoint the relative as Archbishop of Canterbury. So Edward was clearly quite weak there. But in his defence, you could argue that he kept together England. So England didn't fracture under his reign. Allowing the Godwins' power was good in that England stayed together as an entity and didn't fracture. So there is that. So if we just link it back to foreign policy as well, like the Norman courtiers I mentioned, Edward being the son of Emma of Normandy and having grown up in Normandy in exile for most of his life, was very, very pro-Norman. So this is demonstrated, for example, in Westminster Abbey. So he initiated the building of Westminster Abbey, which would have significance later for his sainthood, but also demonstrates his Normanness, if that's the word. I'm not sure. In terms of other bits of foreign policy, he initiated the restoration of Malcolm Canmore to become the King of Scotland in place of Macbeth, which is obviously the story of the Shakespeare play of the same name. So I guess Edward the Confessor is to be thanked for inspiring Shakespeare to write obviously such a fantastic play on that basis. So, Edward, as I mentioned, became a saint, which is why he's called the Confessor. But this campaign did not begin until 1138, when the monks of Westminster Abbey decided to update Queen Edith's, so Edward's wife's, Life of Edward book, which they wanted to do to attract more wealth and power to Westminster Abbey, which they subsequently got. So Henry II took up the cause of Edward's canonisation for political reasons. In 1161, Edward was canonised, and Henry II achieved this by supporting Pope Alexander II's claim to the papal legate. So that was pretty canny of Henry, but also shows that Edward's canonisation was not really for Edward's own sort of piety or his sheer saintliness. It was very much for political reasons as well on the part of Henry II. So he was dedicated to the church, I suppose. Later, for his campaign for sainthood, it was kind of argued that Edward didn't have any children of his own, which obviously is what caused 1066 and all that, because he was celibate and thought it was ungodly to have sex. But it was probably actually down to Edith's maybe lack of being able to conceive, or indeed Edward's problems down south. You don't quite know, but I don't think it was because he was celibate. So, as I mentioned, there was a succession crisis after he died, which is obviously the cause why everyone remembers 1066. So, he might have promised the throne to three people. The first, and the most likely candidate in my opinion, is William the Conqueror, or who would become William the Conqueror. So he'd actually sent Harold Godwinson, when he became the new Earl in 1053, over to Normandy to promise William the Conqueror the throne of England upon Edward's death. But also William got Harold to promise that he would support William's claim to the throne when William did come over to take the throne when Edward died. Obviously history records that Harold didn't do this, because Harold decided to declare himself king when Edward died in January 1066. But William probably has the best claim to the throne, because he was also related to the monarchy through Emma of Normandy, because obviously Emma was, I think, a great aunt of William, so there was a blood claim too. The other two candidates were a grandson of King Edmund II, Edgar Etheling, who you might remember from after the Battle of Hastings. He was declared king. I'll get into that. But he did have a claim. He was the claimant of the House of Wessex still. So he was there. Additionally, the other claim was for Harold Godwinson himself, whose sister Edith was married to King Edward, but that was only a claim in law. It wasn't a claim by blood. So that was kind of a problem. And I guess he can claim his claim through the sheer power he had in the country. The fact that nobles supported him and looked up to the Godwin family, especially over the House of Wessex, who, despite King Edward's sort of like attempts at unity in England, had kind of suffered from a loss in prestige in recent years, because they'd been deposed by Sven Forkbeard, by Cnut, kept out of power by Harthacnut and Harold Hereford. So there was clearly a sort of drawback for the House of Wessex. They weren't as attractive as they were. So that was that. And obviously we know that Edward died in January 1066. And then came along Harold Godwinson's reign, and then eventually the Norman Conquest, and the rest is history. So I think, in my opinion, I'm not sure Edward really cared about the Godwins achieving the power they wanted, because it ultimately made sure that England stayed united. And I think he preferred to do things like hunting. But obviously what happened after his death, I mean, he probably could have done that a little bit better. Edward probably thought, okay, I'm going to clearly appoint this man as successor designate, my heir apparent, that's it. And he could have clearly done that, and he could have saved a lot of blushes, perhaps, that came from the Norman Conquest. But he didn't do that, which perhaps shows he was a little bit weak. And the fact he let the power of the Godwinsons grow so much to the point where they felt they could claim the throne after Edward's death probably speaks a lot of volumes about Edward's character. So I wouldn't rate him too highly. It's cool that he's a saint, but I wouldn't read too much into that. It was very political. But he is the most remembered of the Anglo-Saxon kings, with the exception maybe of Alfred and Cnut. So it is what it is. That is it for the House of Wessex, and of course this episode. The next episode, as we know, is Harold Godwinson's. So I will see you then. Goodbye.